It's an honor to speak, especially some of my heroes are here. Thomas Cahill. Is Mark Kingwell here now? I didn't see. Tomorrow he's another of my heroes. And architects are also my heroes. I feel like I've been in a lifelong conversation with you. I don't look at buildings as things that are just sitting there. I look at them kind of as conversations that are ongoing. I mean, you're not present in them anymore. I mean, you don't hear my responses to your buildings, but I converse with them. I mean, sometimes very favorably. Something is just, unexpectedly there that I need, or a space does the right thing. And sometimes because the space needs to be altered, and then I need to engage directly with what you've set down. And some buildings are open to that conversation, and some buildings seem very closed to that conversation. And the ones that are closed to the conversations are the ones that I'm biased against, and from where I come from anyway. The easiest way for me to explain how I look at the world would be to share with you the typical experience of a kid playing a video game. If you think of yourself or your kid when they get a video game, chances are they take the game out of the box and put the cart in the console, and they play the game as far as they can until they get stuck. Right? And then, unless the game's terrible and they just quit completely, what do? They go on the internet, they find the cheat codes for the game, and they play the game. They'll type into the controller XXY or something when the game is starting up, and now they have infinite ammunition, or they have perfect shielding on their spacesuit, or they have the ability to walk through walls. They have the ability now to play this game as a cheater. Right? So are they playing the game? Yes, they're playing the game, but they're playing the game from outside the original frame of the game. Right now they're playing a kind of a meta game, their own version of the game. They're playing a game with knowledge of what the game rules are, and with the agency to decide whether they're going to stay within those rules or whether they're going to break those rules in order to get to higher levels. So now that they have their infinite ammunition or whatever they have, they keep going through the game. They get all the way now to the end of the game, and they finish. They kill the big dragon or get all the aliens and get to the last. They level up to the end of the game. Then what do if they really like the game? They go back online and they find out what's called the mod of the game. Now I learn how can I change the game to make it the way I want it to be. So instead of playing Doom, where I'm in these dungeons killing monsters, I could change the layout of Doom to be the floor plan of my high school, and turn the monsters into people I know from my school by using their Facebook pages, turn the guns into lassos, or change the fundamental rules of the game and make it, instead of a battle, make it a magic game. So we don't have guns, we have magic wands, and now instead of killing each other, we transform each other into different beings. So now the kid has moved from being a player to being a cheater to being kind of a customizer, a modder, an individual, right, who will now take his mod of the game, his version of the game, they'll upload it to another site where other kids can download it and play it. The reason why he's doing this is not just because he wants to change the game to his own liking. He's doing this because he wants to communicate with others. He wants to generate social currency and reputation for himself by being the guy who made that version of the game that got 50,000 downloads. Right? Because he's the guy that made that cool version of Doom. He's still, in some sense though, he's still a consumer of the game. The last level, the kid who's great at making those mods of the game, the kid who's the best and who's gone through all high school and college making terrific mods, ends up doing what? Ends up crossing the boundary between consumer and employee and becomes an employee of the company that makes these games, or becomes the designer of his own game company. And only then, he is a true programmer now. Now he is not just a creative kid, now he is a creator. Right now he is a programmer, which I would consider sort of the most literate version of the player. So we moved from a player who accepts the rules as they're laid down because that's the only alternative. The rules for him are pre-existing conditions. There's the cheater who knows what the rules are but now has the choice of whether he's going to follow the rules or not. There's the mod who can now write his own rules for the game. And then there's the programmer or designer who can now make his own game, right? Who can create his own pre-existing conditions for those folks. Now these three main shifts, if you will, these what's the first word we're using? I'm so bad with memory now. I'm old. What's the first word? The junctures, the turning points. These three turning points imply four different levels of interactivity, of literacy, of participation, of agency, of creativity, of what I would call humanity, of humanness, of being an actual source of something. And for me, they correspond to the stages that we've gone through historically as we've passed through our renaissances. Right? I don't see the Renaissance as just that big capital R thing we learned about that happened in Europe, whenever that was, in 1500s kind of time. I look at Renaissances as any moment where there was one of these real shifts in our relationship to agency. Usually, well, I'm a media theorist, so I would say usually inspired by a new media technology, by a new way of telling stories, of sharing stories, of transmitting values to one another. So if you look at for me, the big Renaissance moments are the invention of text, way back in the pre-Bible times, the invention of the printing press, right through, ultimately through broadcast media, but the invention of the printing press in the real Renaissance, and right now, the invention of the computer and the internet. And I would argue that the shifts that we had were the same ones, where we moved from being passive players to potential cheaters, to individuals who can create modifications and customization, to potentially being real programmers. So let's look back at the first one, the invention of text. Back in the Bible, this is other people's areas better than mine, but I've read it enough times to have my own, I'm Jewish, I'm allowed to anyway, have my own interpretations of it. There's a great moment in the Bible where God says to Abraham, when he's promising all the good stuff that'll happen if he follows his rules, he says, "You will be a nation of priests." And that always confused me, the idea that Jews are supposed to be priests or something. Is that why we got to wear yarmulkes, because we're all going to be priests? No, look, what was a priest then? A priest at that time was a person who could read and write. What do we call pre-textual writing? Hieroglyph. What does hieroglyph literally mean? Hiero is the priest, you know, from your tarot cards, the Hierophant. The priest, hieroglyph, priestly writing. It's priestly writing because priests, this was what they used. Priests could write. People couldn't. People didn't know. You couldn't learn 5,000, 10,000 of these hieroglyphs. The invention of the alphabet, what was beautiful about it was now with 22 letters of Hebrew, Aramaic, whatever you want to say was first, 22 letters of text, now you had access to reading and writing. Right? So when God says you'll be a nation of priests, what he's implying is you will be a nation who could read and write, who would be literate. I mean, which is still, wouldn't that be a great thing to have a nation of people who were literate? I mean, it's a beautiful idea. A nation of people who can read and write. As far as I'm concerned, the invention of text created a huge cultural shift, a huge change in our relationship to what we saw as the laws of the land, the way things are. Before text, and I would argue before Judaism, Judeo-Christian tradition, the world was just a way, right? You were born into the world. You were born into given circumstances. Whether there was rain or not, or your child lived or not, or you had a good life or a bad life was completely dependent on whether or not the gods had smiled upon you, right? And you took your kid or your goat or your whatever and sacrificed it to the gods to try to appease these bizarre forces of chaos. Law was something that you just followed, right? The Pharaoh's basically king, or Pharaoh's basically God, and he decrees what law is. Along when text comes along, what happens? We get a new kind of religion, Judaism, which is written in the form of a contract. What is a contract? A contract is now an agreement between two parties. Instead of me being born into a pre-existing condition, a game that already exists with rules I know nothing about, now I'm entering into a contract with the deity where I'm a party to this contract. I am voluntarily entering into this arrangement. I mean, as the Jewish myth continues, Moses goes out in the desert with his father-in-law and they write the rules by which they're going to live. When you get text, you no longer have to just inherit law. You can now write the law. And that's what they did. That's pure, what we would now call open source. They're writing the codes by which people are going to live. And it was what invented the notion of progress. It was radical back in those days to imply that human beings could change the world. I mean, this is the beginning of the prophetic tradition. The idea that human beings can mod reality was radical, was illegal, because only the gods can change reality. Now, human beings can change it. Right now, what happens to our civilization is at least partially dependent on how we as human beings behave. That's how you get the notion of progress. That's when time starts just being understood as a circular thing and becomes understood as a linear thing. Because when time is linear, you can now measure your progress. Are we doing better than last year or worse than last year? Better than last century or worse than last century? There's this thing called progress. And because of text, and we were talking about this at the table, we argue. Right? Now that there's text, we have something we can argue about. What does this mean? No, it means this. No, it means that. Right? It's the beautiful conversation begins. The printing press comes along, and it really changes us from readers, if you will, to writers. Or it should. Now with the printing press, right, words get disseminated. And with the computer, we move from writers to programmers. The problem is, with each of these inventions, the public at large, mass culture, doesn't actually gain the ability. We get text as a people. Do all the Israelites, did they all know how to read and write? No. They came to the town square and listened to a rabbi read the Torah to them. Ezra, one of these guys would come and they'd look at the scroll and they would chant it for the people. People didn't learn to read and write. They learned to listen. They learned that cheating was possible. They had a little bit more agency, a little bit more participation, but they could not read. They remained one step behind the Renaissance that was offered them. We get the printing press. Right? It's a beautiful thing. But did we get a nation of writers because of the printing press? No. We got an elite of writers and a nation of readers. The printing press did not lead to a culture of people writing and sharing and disseminating. It led to a culture of gentlemen sitting in their studies with their own books reading. Right? So it's one step behind. They're not writers, they're readers. They're individuals. I mean, during the Renaissance, we even invented the notion of the individual. We invented perspective painting. All of these ideas that everyone has their own perspective, their own view. And there's great writers have understood. Spinoza writes about this. Some great philosophers understood how the Renaissance invented this beautiful notion of the individual, which then led to the Enlightenment. And if we're all individuals, we all have the right to property and to vote. All great stuff. But again, as individuals responding to the text from on high, the broadcast text, the printing press text, or the broadcast media. When the computer comes along, you would think, okay, now we'll get a nation of programmers. But we don't. What do we get? We get a nation of writers. When the computer comes along, we as people get the capability of the last Renaissance. Now we're all free to blog, right? Let them eat blog. What is blogging? It's entering text in a window that's already there. Right? No one even questions, what is blog as a pre-existing condition of my computer universe? You mean there's other ways you could use a computer? Look at the way computers are taught in school. When I was a kid, back in the 70s, we were taught programming. If you took a computer class, you learned BASIC, you learned COBOL, you learned computing. If you take a computing class now in high school, what do you learn? Microsoft Excel, Microsoft Word. You learn how to do PowerPoint. You learn, nothing against it, but you learn applications, not programming. You learn how to be a consumer of computing. See, I do believe we are in the midst of a renaissance as potentially far-reaching as these other renaissances were, but very likely as muted and as unfulfilled as those other renaissances were. I feel that we are going to gain the capability of our Renaissance forefathers, but not of the Renaissance that we're in. And I think it's important that we understand what is this Renaissance that we're in. What is like the old Renaissance in order to know what's particular about it. So we look back at the original Renaissance, and you guys will know this as well or better than me, because you study things, you're architects, you know these historical moments. But what did we get in the real Renaissance? What do you remember from school? We got perspective painting, which is great, which is what? The ability to represent 3 dimensions on 2. We got circumnavigation of the globe, which changed our understanding of the world from being this sort of flat thing to being a round 3-dimensional thing. We got the invention of the sonnet, which was about what? An extended metaphor, being able to relate one thing to another in order to have dimensionality in your poetic description, rather than just, this thing is red, this thing is blue, this thing is, right? No, my love, she's like a flower. And once you have 2, you have parable. You have sonnet. We had the invention of the individual, and oddly enough, we had the invention of centralized currency, which is a biggie for today. It's exactly what we're going through now, is the unwinding of that. And what was centralized currency? It was a way to prevent localities, to prevent individual cities from generating their own value, and instead forcing them to get their value from the center, from the monarch. I mean, it was really a deal, right? It's when we got chartered corporations. There was a great rising merchant class. They were rising. The aristocracy was falling. And before the aristocracy completely fell, they said, let's make a deal. We'll give you monopoly control over an industry if you support us. Okay, that sounds good. Give me a piece, you get a piece, everybody will be happy. So we locked in a certain rising merchant class, and kings got to keep their thrones. What they innovated at that point in order to maintain their power was centralized currency. Before centralized currency, magnificent things were happening on a local level. Late Middle Ages was not a bad time, it was a good time. I mean, where do you think cathedrals came from? Was it the Vatican writing a check and giving it out to Chartres or someone? No, cathedrals came because little towns were so wealthy. They were using local currencies that had a very different bias to them. They ached for reinvestment. People had so much money and they needed things to invest in, so they said, well, why don't we make tourist attractions for pilgrims for the future? And they built cathedrals. That's how wealthy they were. And kings understood these edges are wealthy and I want the wealth. So how do I reverse the economy so that instead of these towns generating wealth and reinvesting in themselves, how can currency be used for me to extract value from them? I will make all of their local currencies, their grain-based currencies, illegal. This is also, you could read about this in the Bible too. I will make grain-based currencies illegal, and they will all have to come to me for currency. In order to establish value, you will have to come to the middle. Just like in order to get a book, in order to get anything, you've got to come to the middle. And that's the same model that we see today. That's why Walmart does better than the local chemist in a town. Now, are there modern equivalents of each of these Renaissance innovations? Yes. The modern equivalent, our Renaissance equivalent of perspective painting is the holograph. Right, but what's the bias of a holograph? I know holograph sounds old, but it's really only 10, 20 years old. Renaissances can go on more than, the 8 months that we're living in right now. A perspective painting did what? It allowed you to see 3 dimensions in 2. What does a hologram really do? It allows you to see 4 dimensions, right? It allows you to see time, right? You can walk in front of a holographic plate and the bird flaps its wings or the girl winks at you. The other interesting thing about a hologram is if you take a holographic plate and smash it on the ground, like one of me, you see the little piece that was here and you pick it up and it's not a picture of my finger. It's a picture of the whole thing. A holographic plate, each little piece recapitulates the whole. It's fractal in that sense, right? It's not a one-to-one correspondence. Instead of circumnavigating the globe, we went into space and orbited the globe and saw our planet from afar as a sphere, rather than as a sphere that we're on. Instead of the sonnet, our modern equivalent would be hypertext. So instead of just relating a flower to my love's face, I can relate anything to anything else. I just link from this to that, to this to that. It's infinite. Instead of the celebration of the individual, we get what? The celebration of the collective, of open source communities, this new localism, new communities, intentional community. And Clay Shirky's new book, Here Comes Everybody. We get great new efforts like Wikipedia, which are coordinated mass group accomplishments, which are more celebrated and more exciting than the accomplishments of individuals. Individuality is even seen as a bit of a ruse. It doesn't even exist. A person is not as strong as his capabilities. A person is as strong as his network, right? As his connection to other people. And just as we saw the rise of centralized currency in the Renaissance, we're now seeing the rise of alternative currency in our Renaissance. It started with things as simple as airplane miles, frequent flyer miles, and Amex points. And now that the central bank can no longer provide us with money, it's local investment. In my town, there's a guy who wants to expand his restaurant into a second shop. He can't borrow money from the bank because the bank's not lending money, because we don't have a local bank. He's got to go to Citibank. So what is he doing? He's asking us to give him money, people who live in the town. We can buy a credit card for his restaurant. You put $1,000, you get $1,200 of food. And for those of us who go there all the time, that's a great deal. It's a 20% immediate return on my investment. He gets the money he needs to build his next restaurant, and he gets it cheaper than he'd get it from the bank, and I get a better value on my food, and I get a better restaurant in my town, and my town gets better. In the strictest sense, in the Renaissance, that would have been illegal. In the strictest sense, in the modern sense, that still might be slightly illegal. Because there's a banking monopoly. And look how well they've done. All of these innovations, though, are a result of, in one way or another, of computing and networking. Computing and networking really was a big thing. The crash that we're experiencing today, this billion-dollar, trillion market yada-yada, is really just the echo of the dot-com crash. That's all this is. The dot-com crash happened. There was still all this cash rolling around. They changed some laws. Let's shove it into mortgages and get another bubble, another place to stick the money. Right? That's because the business in America is money, is centralized currency. That's our biggest industry. Central bank lends money to another set of banks at one rate of interest, who then loan it to other banks at another rate of interest, who then loan it to other banks at another rate of interest, who then package it at another rate of interest, who then loan it to other banks, who then loan it to us. Right? The centralized banking equation, the rules of the game, as it comes out of the box, are for us as individuals to be drained, or for us to go bankrupt. That's the way it works. $100,000 of money is lent to a business by the bank. That business then has to make $300,000 in order to pay the bank back, right? That's how interest works. Where does that business get the other $200,000? From other people who have borrowed $100,000 from the bank. For this guy to pay back the extra $200,000, these two guys have to go bankrupt. That's the way it works, unless you pump more money at greater interest. The central bank monopoly is partly collapsing because it has been unable to absorb the shift that a network culture forces. The shift that a network culture forces is that instead of all value and ideas coming from the center, great value and ideas is coming from the periphery. From anyone with a machine, from anyone with the software, from anyone who has creative capability with this tool. Our economy doesn't understand how to deal with a non-extractive value chain. It doesn't know how to deal with markets that aren't scarce. It doesn't know how to deal with great things that are in abundance. And that's why we're in the situation we're in. That's why the banks are crashing. As far as I'm concerned, even though it's painful in some ways, it's a good thing that this is happening. Because the opportunity it allows is for us, if we are truly members of this Renaissance and not just throwbacks to the last one, it allows us finally to seize. This is the window of opportunity, to seize on the ability to become our world's programmers. And I don't just mean this in terms of computers. Computers are not the only thing that's open source. Reality itself is open source. A hell of a lot more of the world you're looking at is software than it is hardware. Only when you're born into a world that's operating this way, you can't help but think of it as hardware because that's the way it always is. But once you have the open source sensibility, once you've played with a program, once a kid has even just edited a news show, anyone who's experienced that creative moment, we used to in the 60s and 70s, we talked about it as the psychedelic moment. But now it's really just the creative moment. The open source sensibility, they look at everything in an open source way. You look at your town and you say, oh, I get it. God didn't just make the streets like this. There were people who planned the streets to be like this. Some of them were well-meaning and wanted us to be able to walk around and talk. Some of them weren't well-meaning and wanted us to really respect that statue in the town square or really think that the bank was the right place, or they wanted us to move in a way that was more efficient, or these guys wanted us to move in a way, I mean, you're architects, you know this. There's agendas in the design that you can program into your buildings, just as there are agendas that you can program into everything. Your currency, your mail, your food, your language, your medical system, it's all open source. What I believe, and what I believe is so frightening at this moment, is that we are getting an inkling of the fact that everything is up for discussion. This is what made Judaism so dangerous way back when, was that someone was willing to go up to God and go, can we talk? As Joan Rivers, can we talk? What if, Abraham, back to Abraham. What if I find 40 nice people in this town? Will you not wreck it then? Sodom and Gomorrah. What if there's 10? What if there's 5? I'll negotiate. The beginning of the cheater, right? He's not the world creator. He's not quite, he's not there yet, but everything's up for discussion. There are no pre-existing conditions. This is why we have the creationism evolution debate. The real reason we have it is because if it wasn't created to be this way, if our reality is not a pre-existing condition, what does that mean? It means we are in charge of it. And if we're in charge of it, it means we're in charge of it. And that's a level of responsibility that we're not willing to grab right now. That we say we are, but we're not, or we'd be doing it. I believe that we are moving from the one way of playing games, which is playing to win. Right? That's the way you play. One way of seeing stories, you tell a story to get to the end, to find out if the hero won or lost. To a very different way of living, to what we would call a sustainable model of life, which is not about winning or losing. It's about keeping it going. It's a different structure of story, where instead of aching for conclusion, winning, losing, damnation, salvation, Marxism and Darwinism and everyism, instead of looking for that, looking for how does it go on? Not a destined narrative. There's no happy ending, because there's no ending at all. It's an open narrative. The best games, I think, the games I would program, the games our kids would program, the games that we would program if we were kind of listening to our best selves rather than our frightened selves, would not be games that we lose or win, but games that we write in order to keep on playing. Right? The object of the game is not to win. The object of the game is to get to keep playing. And that, unfortunately, is actually a dangerous idea in a world where we would prefer to believe that someone's in charge than that we are.